We have an experiment with baking soda and baking powder. Baking soda is a sodium bicarbonate, and it requires an acid to activate it. When an acid activates it, it releases carbon dioxide, which in baked good causes dough to rise. Baking powder also contains sodium bicarbonate. It also contains an acidifying agent, usually cream of tartar. It's also a drying agent or a starch. The same chemical reaction happens in baking powder as in baking soda, but only requires moisture to activate it. I chose a biscuit recipe, and the biscuit recipe calls for baking powder because there is no acid in the recipe to activate the baking powder or baking soda. Baking powder also gives a neutral flavor. Baking powder can be substituted for baking soda, but baking soda cannot be substituted for baking powder because an acid is necessary to activate. In my recipe, shortening is used. Shortening is a lipid or a fat. It is used to weaken gluten strands in wheat by adding fat, and it gives baked goods a tender texture. In my recipe, it calls for 2 cups of flour, 1 tablespoon of baking powder, half a cup of shortening, and 3/4 cup of 2% milk. First, you need to preheat the oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, you mix in a large bowl the flour. Oh, don't want to forget the salt. There's a half a teaspoon of salt also used. You mix the salt, the flour, the shortening, and the baking powder in a large bowl. After it becomes a coarse texture, you add in the milk. You turn the dough out on a lightly floured surface and toss with flour until no longer sticky. Then you roll the dough out into a 1/2 inch thick sheet and cut with a floured biscuit or cookie cutter. I happen to use a shot glass since I did not have a cookie cutter. You place the biscuits on an ungreased baking sheet and bake in the preheated oven until golden brown for about 10 minutes. In my recipe, I substituted baking soda for baking powder to see if there was any difference. Let's see the results. Here we have the biscuits that I used the original recipe with baking powder. You can see that they have risen and have a nice fluffy texture. On the other hand, I used baking soda in these, and you can see that they did not rise as well, and they don't have as nice of a texture. They're more crusty. And you can tell from this experiment that baking soda cannot be substituted for baking powder if there's not an acid to activate it. And in my recipe, there was no acid.